Most people come to Hollywood and never become famous or rich. A few become rich, but not famous, and some become famous, but not rich. This week, I'm joined by writer and historian Karina Wilson, who is going to tell us about someone whose character became iconic, definitely famous, but who never reaped any financial reward for the cultural phenomenon she created. Karina, who are we talking about today?
We are talking about the wonderful Maila Nurmi, also known to most people as Vampira.
Vampira. And I'm sure everyone has a picture in their head of what Vampira looks like, even though her show was really only on for like a year and not much of it got permanently recorded, which is amazing. Like it's that cultural touchstone, something. So we're going to dive into all that because it's so fascinating. But before we begin, we always talk about what is a spooky thing that happened to us recently. And there is a lot of spooky astrology going on. We're in between eclipses right now. We have Mercury retrograde. We have Venus retrograde. All these planets are in Aries. So what have you been experiencing, Karina?
Well, I actually did have a very Mercury retrograde Sunday in that I went to San Juan Capistrano with a friend and we had a lovely day. And I decided, because I'm a train nerd, that I wanted to get the train back. And so I got on the Amtrak train and it all was going well. And I met this really nice woman that was, hi, Erin, if you're listening, that was sitting next to me. And we were having that kind of like strangers on the train, just chit-chatting. And, you know, it was...
You weren't plotting a murder, though.
We did actually end up plotting a murder. But then the train ground to a halt just outside Norwalk. And there was an announcement saying that they'd lost power. And we ended up being delayed for 4 hours.
Oh my god!
Which was just, and it was like, well, the sun was setting, and I have to say that all the passengers seemed really chill about it. There was no arguments, no riots, but they had to send a rescue train from LA to come get us.
Oh, wow.
And it towed us into Norwalk station itself because we were just south. And then we had to all get off the original train and get onto the rescue train. And as I say, ended up kind of grinding into LAX Union Station 4 hours late, which was not on my bingo card for Sunday. But in the meantime, my new friend and I, we figured out like a whole TV show based around a kind of like real life intersection of all the little dramas that could be happening on the train while it was delayed for 4 hours, including like a couple falling in love, an assassination happening.
Yeah, that would be great.
And of course, it devolved into like there was, as the sun went down, like somebody who was actually transformed into a monster at dusk, some kind of
there you go.
Vampire who thought that they would be in LA at Union Station in really good time to do their transformation in private, had to transform in the carriage, and so it was kind of a really fun way to
sounds like a lot of fun. But I love those where a bunch of strangers are trapped together and they have to work on something, either solving a murder or working together to defeat the bad guy or whatever.
Yes, or the tentacled monstrosities lurking outside the train windows after dark, because normally there are no trains on the track in this section after dark for very good reasons.
That's a great Mercury retrograde story. I've been seeing a lot of Mercury retrograde stories around me, and I'm not a weirdo enough to tell someone, oh, by the way, that's Mercury retrograde. That's why that's happening. But my farrier had to cancel our horseshoeing appointment because a light post fell over in front of his truck and he couldn't get out. But on my way to work yesterday, I passed a car accident. While I was in my office, I heard tires screeching. I looked up and looked out the window, and a pedestrian got hit by a car and he had a head injury and he was bleeding all over the sidewalk. Someone called 911 and came right away, and I hope he's okay. And then on my way home, as I was biking home, I passed someone who looked not unlike the pedestrian that got hit, but this was a completely different neighborhood, with a bandage around his head, and he had dried blood dripping down the side of his face. So it was definitely the vibe of all the planets being in Aries, Mercury retrograde, it's been around, and it's good astrology. Let's get into our discussion about Vampira, who has lived the most amazing, interesting, authentic life. And that is, I think, why certain people are able to create something that is so memorable, is because it comes from, that's my theory at least, it comes from an authentic part of them. There's so many people who come to Hollywood and want to be famous, but they aren't willing to be authentic. Maila Nurmi is a really authentic person. So who is Maila Nurmi?
Well, she is a one-time starlet and cheesecake model who happened to be in the right place at the right time, the Belcarrie Ball. And that's always, I think, a part of any good Hollywood mythology, is that you go to a party and the right person sees you. And
well, what's a cheesecake model first?
So a cheesecake pinup model it was a very specific type of modeling that really
in like the 1950s or
the 1930s, 40s and 50s.
Okay.
So it was women who were photographed in very artificial, stylized ways in bikinis. They had incredible bodies, and they very often were photographed in a kind of dominant position. So they were looking down on the men. If you think of the kind of, I think Lana Del Rey adopts quite a lot of the cheesecake aesthetic for some of her imagery. And the idea was that men would see these images of haughty, unattainable women, but wearing bikinis and looking very, very sexualized. And it was the kind of the masturbation fodder for soldiers overseas. And it was a kind of a nod and a wink, because these were all they were all American girls, incredibly kind of healthy and statuesque. But they were there for wank mag fodder, as we would say in the UK. And it was a respectable enough career being a cheesecake model. A lot of actresses, including Marilyn Monroe and Jane Mansfield and people like that, started out doing pinup photos. But you could end up doing the sort of seedier side of it, as Marilyn Monroe did. She ended up doing a nude work and the infamous Stag film. But to be a cheesecake model was, it was something that young, beautiful women who first arrived in Hollywood would do. And it didn't necessarily destroy any chance of a career as an actor. It got them a chance to get into the public eye. It got them invited to parties, all the kind of important things. It was a way of being introduced to important and influential people, as we will see with Maila. It was also, if you were creative and if you did understand, as Maila always did, the relationship between the camera and the object, then it could be a fun thing, because a lot of it, Betty Page is probably the most famous cheesecake model, and she really understood that very coy come hither, how she mixed sort of very sexualized imagery with coy postures. And she understood how to send the imagination riot without necessarily being overtly sexual. It's that kind of come hither, go thither vibe.
Do we know anything about Maila's personality as a young person when she's growing up?
Yes. She was born to an immigrant Finnish family in 1922, and she grew up mostly in Astoria, Oregon, although her father, who was a journalist and political speaker, moved around a lot. She had a brother, Robbie, and her mother, Sophia, as detailed in the very good book about her, Glamour by her niece, Sandra Naimi, was unfortunately an alcoholic. So Maila, as a young child, quite often wanted to escape into herself. She always felt ugly growing up, like an outsider. She felt she didn't share the aspirations or the aesthetic or the just the general intelligence level, I think, of her classmates. And she sought refuge, as so many others who grew up during this era did, in comic books. So she loved disappearing into other worlds and reading about pirate adventures.
Oh, I love that.
And she especially identified with a female pirate called the Dragon Lady, who appeared in the whole series of comics. And she would later use elements of the Dragon Lady when she was creating Vampira. So she was a dreamer. She was very well read. And her father, who was a public speaker, raised her also to be a public speaker. So she when she was a teenager, she ended up working in the fish plant for a while. And a story at the time was like, you grew up, you worked in the fish factory, or you went into local farming. It wasn't a great place if you were ambitious or you loved art. And so she always dreamed of escape, of getting out.
And it seemed like she could never please her mother. And her mother even kind of like put down her dreams or her flights of whimsy. Like she heard Orson Welles on the radio and she was like, he's so smart. That man is my friend. And her mom just went off on her and was like, don't talk like that. People will think you're crazy. And so it seems like she really was like prone to these whimsical, imaginative ideas. And her mom just like shut that down.
She had the soul of an artist. We talk a lot about artists, but I think it's something you are born with, that you cannot do anything but create, but be imaginative, but create worlds that you live in that are so far removed from your reality. And I think that split sometimes comes from having an unhappy childhood, from having not necessarily physically abusive parents, but emotionally abusive or withdrawn parents. Sophia had her own problems. I think the father was very often away from the family home for long periods of time, could have been seeing other women. Sophia, as I mentioned, took refuge in the bottle, which seems to be a particular sort of revenge, because Maila's father was a temperate, and the whole community were very into temperance.
Oh, wow.
So, and not drinking. So the fact that the Oni, the father, was out there kind of speaking about being teetotal, and his wife was an alcoholic, but a secret kind of 1930s, 1940s drinking at home alcoholic.
And so do you know what motivated Maila to become an actress?
I think what motivated her was this desire to create and to project and to tell stories. Like, she had this very pure artistic impulse. When she decided she wanted to be an actor and to go to Hollywood, she claimed that she was actually the niece of an athlete who shared this last name, Nurmi, which wasn't her original. She changed her name. She was born Maila Elizabeth, and I cannot pronounce the Finnish.
It's a long last name.
And she changed it to Nurmi. And she claimed that she was the niece of an athlete called Paavo Nurmi, and that she'd been born in Finland, all to make her seem much more exotic than she was. Because, as I say, Astoria, Oregon was just a very working class, cloudy grey skies, not an exciting place to come from.
How did her start happen?
So she relocated to Los Angeles, as so many young women did in the early 1940s, because it was a magnet. It was the place where women could go, and especially during the war years, be incredibly free. Women roomed together in houses. There were a lot of jobs available, and a variety of jobs available for women. They could pay their own way. They didn't need chaperones to go places. Los Angeles was actually a really good place to be a woman in the early 1940s. And so she came here, she wanted to lead a bigger life. In retrospect, it seems that her dream wasn't actually to be an actress, but to have what nowadays we might call a platform. And her professed goal was to become an evangelist, like Amy Semple McPherson. So she wanted the kind of the glitz and the glamour and the adulation of being a movie star, but a movie star who completely controlled her own image and was doing it for a good cause.
So was she religious at all?
It's the old California cliche. I think she was spiritual rather than religious. She loved animals throughout her whole life. She, her rescue animals were the closest beings to her in her later years. She had a strong moral compass, as we'll come to see. And I think she genuinely wanted to make the world a better place. And the idea that she could do that as an evangelist, I mean, it seemed like there were no influencers then. She was an influencer before there were influencers.
She was born in the wrong time.
Yeah, she was born in the wrong time. But she wanted to reach people's hearts and minds.
And so 1944 was a very eventful year for her, wasn't it?
Yes. At the time, a young actress could make her name in Hollywood, or you could do it in New York on Broadway and then come to Hollywood. So she tried a few things. She did some early modeling and wasn't really getting the traction. So she took the train to New York. There's a whole story about kind of who she met and the adventures that she had on the way. And she actually landed a part in a show with Mae West on Broadway, which could have been like a huge thing for her, but Mae West had her fired. But it was actually enough for Maila to kind of get the notice that the kind of notice and attention that she needed. And then she went whizzing back to Hollywood to be in a Howard Hawks movie. But then there's the whole story about how she didn't like the way that Howard Hawks spoke to her or treated her as a commodity. Again, he made her wait around with the contract. So she tore the contract up in front of him, in front of Howard Hawks, probably one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, said, screw you, and tore it up and tossed it in his waistbin and walked out. And
this is a trend, though, throughout her life. She does not tolerate being disrespected.
No, she does not tolerate being disrespected. But also during 1944, she encountered Orson Welles. You just mentioned this is the guy that she'd heard on the radio, and she was like, oh my God, someday he's going to be my friend. And she met him in Hollywood.
And what was their relationship like?
Maila had a friend called Junie, and they went to Musso and Frank's, which we all know here in Hollywood, which is one of the most famous and long-lived bar restaurants in Hollywood. And it was the haunt, and it was for many, many years, of the man whom Maila described as her one true God, and that was Orson Welles. And she rushed up to him because she was still fairly new to Hollywood and was like, oh my God, I think you're amazing. And he did the whole thing. Well, thank you very much. And she says his exact words were, why, yes, indeed I am Orson Welles. And who might you be, my winsome lass? Because she was absolutely stunningly beautiful. Yeah. And so one thing led to another, and she began a brief relationship with Orson Welles. And he was, I think the technical term, he was a well-known pussy hound. Orson Welles slept with everybody.
And he was married to Rita Hayworth at the time.
Yeah. And he seduced her, had sex with her, and she found out that she was pregnant. So that was a reason why she called her mom, and they went to New York, which is where her father was at the time. So she's 20 years old and she's pregnant, and she has the baby, which is Orson Welles' baby, kind of very anonymously in New York. Nobody knows. And she gives the baby up for adoption. The baby's born at March 11th, 1944. And
a Pisces.
Yes. And she gives him up immediately. And at that time, there's no such thing as an open adoption. You give the baby up and that's it. There's no contact. So she moves on. She tries not to be bitter, but it makes her very cynical. The fact that she's been through this whole thing. She was very lucky that her parents took care of her, but Orson Welles treated her very badly.
Especially you're starstruck. You're like, he's my hero. Maybe this is meant to be. Maybe he really does like me as much as I like him.
But, I said earlier that in many ways, Maila epitomizes the Hollywood dream. And this is unfortunately one of the very frequent and dark aspects of the Hollywood dream is that young women, young, beautiful, naive women pour into Hollywood, or they used to. They can't afford to live here anymore. Yeah. They used to pour into Hollywood on a daily basis, and there were predators waiting for them. Some of the predators had famous faces. Some of them did not, but all these predators dangled, the promise of connections that would lead to stardom in front of these young women in return for sex. And then because, there were so many, that you could have sex with an incredibly beautiful woman one night, and just dump her the next, and she was instantly replaceable. And it was, it's the casting couch, but not even the casting couch. It's beyond that. It's this idea that the young women, for depending on your proclivity, the young men who came to Hollywood just became a smorgasbord. And, that's something that, I think has underpinned a lot of haunted Hollywood stories. It's a horror story.
It's like the thing that you want can be your greatest weakness.
Yeah. And also, I think if you're seducing somebody, if your persona and your fame has done a lot of the kind of the seduction work for you.
Yeah.
When they come to you and they have eyes like saucers and they're impressed by everything you say, I would imagine that it makes it only too easy.
Yeah.
Because you don't even have to approach a stranger at a bar and neg them. You know, they come to you and they're like, oh my God, you're my biggest hero and you're talking to me and this is a dream come true.
And I don't know how much time we should spend on who the baby was, but eventually...
It's a very cute story.
Yeah, story.
I think because... So she gave up this baby, never thought to hear from him ever again, as you didn't at the time. And many years later, I think 2018, her family, a member of her family did a 23andMe genetic test and was told, oh, you have a cousin. And they located this guy who was actually an assistant AG. He's it's called David Putter, and he knew he was adopted.
Assistant Attorney General,
of Vermont. And so he was in his obviously he was in his sort of 70s at that point, and he basically got a phone call going, well, hey, I know you never knew who your biological parents were. You know, you can imagine, young man, your biological parents are Orson Welles and Vampira. I mean, what a trip!
Mind blowing. Can you imagine?
I know, and if you see photos of him, he does actually look like Orson Welles. You can kind of see it.
Oh my gosh. But what and he spends his whole life feeling kind of like an outsider. His mom died right at it. And so he was always kind of like this orphan. And then he finds out like he has incredibly iconic, famous parents. It's just amazing, like a fairy tale.
And it is one of those things where for many years, obviously, people thought Vampira was the epitome of the childlessness, and Maila had never had any children. And then it all kind of came out sort of after she died, is that, you know, she'd had this secret baby. So yeah, it's kind of I think it, you know, in keeping with a lot of the rest of her story, it ends well.
Yeah.
Or it ends better than you might have hoped it would.
Yeah. Let's actually jump ahead to Vampira. How did Vampira come to be?
Well, as I mentioned, she'd been working as a pinup model and not really getting the break that you need. She had all these ambitions. And so she decided to go to the Valkyrie ball and really go all out with the costume. So she had been reading the Addams Family cartoon in the newspapers for years, and she decided to create a costume inspired by Mrs. Addams, who wasn't called Morticia at that point. She was only called Morticia after the TV show in 1964. And so she made a dress, she cinched her waist, she rented a movie wig from Max Factor Hollywood, which was actually an Indian wig, and she painted her face grey and went barefoot. And she adopted this kind of weird zombie-like blank effect, which was really what made the costume. And so the Ghoul Girl, as she was known, won the first prize at this costume ball. Now, a guy named Hunt Stromberg, who had just become, the programming director at KABC, saw her, remembered how the crowd loved her. And a few months later, he tracked her down when he was looking for a way to package old horror and thriller B-movies for Saturday night television on KABC. Because at the time, the TV was really just starting to, it was a very new medium. The TV was really just starting to make headway into people's homes, and these channels were setting themselves up and they needed content, very much like streamers. You know, half a century later, they needed content to attract and to keep viewers. And so what they were able to buy cheaply were the B-movies that had been made in the 40s and 30s. But you can't just show a bunch of B-movies. You needed to kind of like string them together. So Stromberg thought of a way of asking Vampira to kind of be the host, as it were. And he finally got in touch with Maila. She loved the idea, and the rest is history.
And what was the audience reaction to Vampira?
They absolutely loved her. She created this character that she described as one part Greta Garbo, 2 parts each of the Dragon Lady, Evil Queen, and Theda Bara. 3 parts Norma Desmond and 4 parts Bizarre magazine. So she was incredibly kind of sexual. She had a 17-inch waist, which was...
And I love that. Actually,
yeah.
Because the 1950s is such a maternal housewife, woman is the welcoming, nurturing figure. And she is very much, with that tiny waist, not the maternal figure at all. She's like the exact opposite of everything that the 1950s woman stands for.
Yeah, I mean, she was the kind of absolute antithesis, the dark shadow, the Jungian dark shadow of the 1950s housewife. So she lived in an attic that was absolutely filthy, covered in cobwebs. She had a pet spider. She would make cocktails with eyeballs floating in them. And she wore this dress, which was, tattered and dusty. And, because she slept in a bathtub or, came out of the grave. And she was hilarious. She absolutely satirized the whole kind of woman who's there to be subservient to men. She talked about poisoning ex-husbands. She adored her pet spider Rollo, and there was never any kind of man on the horizon. And she, as I say, she channeled these pinup girls that were very influenced by burlesque and the kind of nascent BDSM scene. So there's this kind of implicit dominance in everything that she's doing. Like the man is just being ground beneath her feet. And she had long nails, which were actually bits of plastic kind of stuck onto her. And she vamped it up. And she had all this kind of morbid humor, terrible puns, some of which she came up with herself and some of which were written for her. And it was a whole kind of like persona that really embraced horror and all the kind of the subculture aspects of horror and embraced it as a lifestyle. Like horror wasn't just something you watched in a movie or read in a comic or a book. It was a way of living. And her performance art for that year, like she went all over LA in costume. She rode around in a hearse with a parasol, and she loved scaring children who absolutely loved being scared by her. She showed up at all kinds of events as Vampira, and she really just, for somebody who was a local TV host for just under a year, 11 months, she had a huge cultural impact. There was a photo spread that featured her in Life magazine. I
was just reading that before we began. And it's so funny because you have these really dark photos of her. And then the rest of the magazine is like these colorful housewife advertisements of products that housewives would buy, and then the smiling housewives. And then there's this whole Vampira spread. And I'm like, oh, I love the contrast.
And she was, one of the many reasons that I love her so much was that she was really only famous for this kind of 11 months where she was queen of the city for that 11 months. And that was also the period of time when she was running around with James Dean, who was her best friend. And, I've always been fascinated by James Dean ever since I was a teenager. And that's really my first contact with Maila as the person rather than the sort of the superficial image. And her relationship with James Dean was, again, it's kind of like a lot of the elements that we consider part of the Hollywood dream. Like she was in theory had the world at her feet, and he'd made East of Eden, but it wasn't released yet. So he knew that these were the last months where he got to be like a little weirdo, which was his kind of instinct. And she saw him at the August 1954 premiere of Sabrina at the Paramount Theatre, which is now the El Capitan in Hollywood. And she saw him on a kind of like forced studio date with the actress Terry Moore, who was very kind of like blonde and buxom and the exact thing that Vampira was set up to lampoon. And she said, here comes this guy in a tux with Howard Hughes' whore on his arm. She has a loopy smile on her face, clearly enjoying the attention, but he is mad. It was obviously a studio date. He's angry to have to be there, and he certainly doesn't want to be with her. And I knew I had to meet this guy. And so she then runs into him, like, so the legend goes, literally the following day, and they get to talking, and that's it. And they realize that they were kind of soulmates. And she said about him,
and she's more famous than him.
She's more famous than him at this point.
He's not even anyone, really.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of like everybody knows him. Like he'd been in LA for a couple of years at that point, and he got his big break, and it was a big break, starring in this movie East of Eden. And he was just in that bit that strange time where the movie was in the can, and there was a lot of talk about he was going to win an Oscar, and it was incredible, and it is an incredible performance, but he's just kind of waiting for it to be released, and the studio are kind of sending him out on dates and trying to build his reputation in the press because he's their star, and they've already locked him in for Giant and Rebel Without a Cause. And she said, "We were psychic twins, Jimmy and I. Both of us were misunderstood in a world of strange beings. When at age 31 I met Jimmy, he was the first entity of my own species I'd ever encountered. When at 23 Jimmy met me, he thought he'd at last met someone from his own planet. We became instantly glued to one another. Our psyches melded."
Do you think they were both autistic?
I think artistic. And again, going back to this concept of like just being pure artist, because Jimmy Dean, he had such a vision of, again, the stories that he wanted to tell. And you look at, the way he revolutionized sort of representation of young people in those, those three movies that he was in. I mean, Maila Nurmi leaves 11 months of not recorded TV shows, and James Dean leaves three movies. But their legacy and the shadow that they cast was completely disproportionate to the work that they gave the world. And they hung out together. They talked a lot. They had another friend called Jack Simmons, who was a TV actor, and he had an old hearse, and they used to ride around at night in this converted hearse and dare each other to break into morticians' offices. And there's all kinds of stories about what they got up to. They were known as the Night Watch by the other clientele at Googie's, which was a coffee shop at Sunset and Crescent Heights, which is now a shopping mall, and it breaks my heart every time I go past. And they just kind of like hung out. And I think in common with a lot of her other relationships, because she also was very good friends with Marlon Brando. She hung out with Elvis for a bit. Maila was really smart. I think possibly because of that early encounter with Orson Welles. Like she was really smart when it came to men, because she understood that a lot of these men who become famous or who want to become famous, they do not want smart, challenging women. They want the easy, compliant women.
Marlon Brando proposed marriage to her a bunch of times, right?
Yeah, and she said she later on told her niece why she refused him. He was a sex addict and a hypocrite. He would have cheated on me within a week. And she knew that, and she knew that about these men. She knew that they were moody, that they liked to be cruel, that they had this kind of like star quality, which meant that women threw themselves at them, and that for them, getting a woman to fall into bed was like the easiest thing in the world. But she wasn't interested in them as lovers. She was interested in what lay behind their charisma, which was often deep insecurity. I mean, obviously, James Dean's mom died when he was young, and he was a very fragile person, and she saw that. She was one of the very few people who kind of saw him for who he was. And I think Brando was the same. She met him in the mid-40s in New York. And supposedly they spent the night together, but then they remained friends, right up until I think, the 80s. He dies in 2004, but he left Hollywood. He was sending her money and kind of keeping an eye out for her, because again, this was this incredibly attractive, charismatic, broody man who had all these women for, I guess, the superficial level of relationships, but they befriended Maila because she gave them something. And I keep using the word pure because that's what I think about her, kind of like her core fire and her purity. And they appreciated that and they understood it. And, Elvis was another one. When she was working with Liberace in Vegas, she met a young Elvis Presley who was just, again, on the rise. And again, he was much younger than her. And he played a gig. and it didn't go down well with the older audience, but she went up to him and was like, "You're going to be a superstar." That was incredible. And they hung out for a couple of weeks. And again, she told the story about how he tried to seduce her, and she just said no. But they hung out and had a load of fun and went to shows together. And he was on his way Elvis was obviously on his way to superstardom. And she was definitely on the slide to obscurity then. But for a couple of weeks, they existed on the same plane. And she did seem to kind of like have that magic. Later in life, she also had a relationship with Anthony Perkins. And again, that kind of went backwards and forwards. And she could never be the compliant, meek wife of a famous person that he wanted her to be.
Yeah.
But she recognized his cruelty towards women. So, I think she was incredibly smart. And she had relationships. She was in a common law marriage with the screenwriter Dean Eisner. There was some less advised relationships kind of going into the 60s. But at the end of her life, as I say, she really got it sorted in that she was just surrounded by her rescue animals, which
that's the way.
As we all know, that is the real rescue animals are your true loves.
Exactly. And her friends showed up at her funeral, and that's what you want.
Yeah.
So why was Vampira canceled?
Well, when she originally created the character, the deal that she did was not a great deal, but she managed to claim 51% of the character. So she owned the character, and KABC had the sort of minor stake in it. She was only paid $75 a week, and she didn't get paid for personal appearances, which she could have made absolute bank on. But KBC kind of stood in her way. She could have really, made hay during those months, but she didn't. And then she started to get a bit headstrong, and she wanted to do other things. In 1955, she was invited to perform on the George Gobel show, which was actually an NBC show. So it was a rival to KABC. And the problem was that it aired live because most TV at that point was live, which is why we don't have any recordings except for a few things. And it aired from 10 to 11. And Maila's show on KBC started at 11. So KBC said, "Do not appear on the Gobel show." But she did anyway. Thank goodness she did, because that is some of the only surviving footage of her.
Yeah.
And, she participates in comedy sketches, and she's hilarious and charismatic. And it was a national show as well. Mm-hmm. So it was viewed by millions of people across the USA. And it was kind of like the real high point of her career comes on that Saturday night. But then she couldn't make it back to her attic in time. She is late, and they tell her that she's fired.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
And they offered to buy her out of the character because they figured out that that Vampira was popular, not Maila. And she refused, because she had that stubborn streak, as we established with the Howard Hawks incident. And it was the 1950s. These were men. They didn't want to deal with a difficult, quote unquote, woman. And she was just fired, and that was it.
Her show is canceled. But what's the legacy of her show?
So she did kind of like putter on for the next few years. She was forbidden to do anything as Vampira for about 6 months, but she did do some kind of personal appearances. She did the tour with Liberace.
And so is she like as Vampira with Liberace? What is this show with Liberace?
So Liberace was Liberace was also, I think, struggling to find his persona, his niche in Vegas. And he wasn't the kind of superstar that he later became. So he did this sort of variety show, and there were some sketches involving Vampira. And she'd sort of pop up and do a couple of little bits that, with the same sort of terrible puns and ghoul humor. And it wasn't a huge success, but it was work. And he invited her to go to the UK and, continue it. But that didn't work out. I mean, she had some pretty traumatic things happen to her. A man, there was a home invasion.
Yeah, like a stalker, held her for 2 hours, right?
Mm-hmm. I think it was longer than that. She answered the door to this guy who kind of pushed his way in, and it turned out that he wasn't you know, just to backtrack a moment, there were a lot of awful fans who kind of like hung out, and particularly after James Dean's death, they blamed her for somehow cursing James Dean and somehow causing his death, which just wasn't the case at all.
Yeah.
So she was so, you know, she had this sort of brief period of fame and then was cursed by the really dark side of fame, which is the fans who found her address, who kind of hung out outside her house. And they weren't fans that necessarily loved her. They were fans who had loved Jimmy Dean. And, you know, her house gets set on fire at one point. There's this guy who it turns out wasn't a stalker. He actually just, you know, he was looking for somebody who'd lived in that apartment beforehand. But it was terrifying. You know, she was assaulted. I think she had to escape naked.
Oh, God.
And, you know, run screaming into a restaurant for help. It was really, really
and
traumatic.
And the press like made light of her attack.
Yes. Vampira was a joke that she was in on and that she created. But after the show was cancelled, she kind of lost control of Vampira, the joke, and the joke was kind of used to attack her. And it's, you know, there are some, we were talking about Mercury retrograde coincidences, like this guy had done this kind of thing before, and his street name was The Vamp.
Oh, no.
His name was Ellis Barber, and his arrest record included attempted rapes. So, you know, she was nude. She was topless when she escaped from him. And, you know, it was a huge news story, and it was, they wanted to show pictures of her bruises. And it was just, you know, we think about the press, the way that they say hounded Princess Diana to death in 1990s. But in the 1950s, there's like an extra double helping of misogyny. And the press didn't like her because of this whole kind of like James Dean connection. And in 1956, the Whisper magazine story, which kind of destroys her. So
And what was that story?
Okay, so the attack on her happens at the end of 1955. So she's still very traumatized by the loss of her best friend, and she's living in New York. She's just, you know, trying to pick herself up again, having lost her 1955 was an annus horribilis. It really was. And so in February 1956, Whisper magazine calls her James Dean's Black Madonna and does this whole expose 5-page spread that says, you know, this is the most chilling, tragic love story in Hollywood history. It accuses her of having voodoo dolls, using black magic, and said that they were lovers. But when he became famous, he dumped her, and in retaliation, she cast a spell on him, saying that she was a witch. And it was just awful, and it was a scandal, and it sold a lot of magazines, and it became national news as well. And they managed, I mean, there's a headline from the Daily News which manages to just show how horrible it was for her. TV's female Dracula battles rapist strangler after fleeing from hoodoo she feared killed James Dean. So she went from being America's dark sweetheart to being completely misunderstood, fingers pointed. Again, that's the kind of fame machine. When you fall hard. And, you know, the rest of her life,
she got beaten up by no fault of her own, just a bunch of horrible circumstances.
Yeah. And she lives with this damage. But, you know, there's a documentary it's available on Tubi called Vampira and Me.
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah. It shows her in her 80s, like I think it's the interviews come from like almost a year or so before her death. And she's vibrant, and her eyes sparkle, and she's put her makeup on, and she's telling these great stories. So basically after, you know, by the end of the 50s, she was completely done in showbiz, and she cleaned houses for friends, and she installed linoleum flooring for a living, and she made furniture, and she opened a shop on Melrose called Vampira's Attic, which was a kind of like a junky antiques store. And she sold jewelry and clothing and what we would now call upcycled furniture. And she managed to, get a bit of a celebrity clientele. She had a few small roles in movies, including one called The Beat Generation.
I kind of love the clip from that because it's like she has a white rat on her shoulder. She's talking about
she's doing poetry.
Yeah, the parents, oppressing their kids, all true stuff. But it's like the Beat kids are the villains in this movie. It's like propaganda for the status quo, basically. But her character, who is saying the correct things, is the villain. And I kind of bad teenagers, all juvenile delinquents of the 1950s. Yeah, rebelling against their parents. Meanwhile, it's like, well, maybe the parents need to be rebelled against because they're not.
Yeah, they're tearing them apart.
Yeah,
as the rebel without a cause. Anyway, so she basically is in this kind of what must have felt at the time humiliation after humiliation. And her final kind of on-screen humiliation of this period was Ed Wood asked her to be in his movie Plan 9 from Outer Space.
And tell us about Ed Wood, just in case no one knows who Ed Wood is.
Yeah, Ed Wood was a man who loved movies not wisely, but too well, to misquote Shakespeare, Othello. And he made a lot of movies that are so terrible, they have become cult classics. Like the dialogue is wooden and barely makes any sense. Forget about plots, special effects, kind of whatever the opposite of special is. And he hired people who, in some ways were, had been legitimate performers and got them at the end of their careers when they were either so alcoholic or frail that they just, they would do anything. And unfortunately, he offered Maila $200 to be Vampira in this movie. So he's not offering her a part, he's offering Vampira the part. And he wrote such terrible dialogue that she said she wasn't going to say the dialogue, she would just scream, because the scream was a very important feature of the character. She'd come on, walk on screen and do this kind of orgasmic and very freeing scream. And so she's in Plan 9 from Outer Space, which, because it is so bad it's good, actually then had a much longer afterlife than pretty much anything else she did. So Plan 9 from Outer Space kept being shown and kept finding an audience, and people kept seeing Vampira and going, oh my God, this woman's incredible. And so it's what kind of kept Vampira in the zeitgeist, even though she hated doing it and she felt so insulted. Like, how far have I fallen that I'm working with Ed Wood? I mean, technically she was working with Bela Lugosi as well, but they only have some library footage of him that they tried to ram into the movie. Bela Lugosi was one of her heroes. She'd met him years before and said he was an absolute gentleman. And so that was, I think, one of the ways in which Ed Wood persuaded her. But anyway, she was in Plan 9 from Outer Space, and it was her least favorite thing she ever did, but it was the thing that kind of ironically kept her light burning. And then I think in the early 80s, in about 81, there's enough kind of sort of bubbling under interest that JTV wanted to revive Vampira for TV. And they actually reached out to her and said, would you be involved? And originally they said, oh, well, you can pick the girl and you can train her. And she was really down for that because she didn't want to be Vampira anymore, because to be Vampira, she had to starve herself, I think, 3 days and tenderize her rubbing on her waist. Yeah.
Papaya powder on her waist and then like cinching herself with like a rubber something or other.
And she didn't want to do that anymore, but she loved the idea of retaining some creative control and passing the torch, as it were. And Maila had actually picked her successor, a younger actress named Lola Falana, who was Black and had a very kind of like mysterious edge to her. Would have been, a really interesting way of extending the Vampira universe, if you like. But those old creative differences and the fact that the men thought they knew better all killed Vampira for a second time. And they hired the person we now know as Elvira, Cassandra Peterson, who is, if you've ever seen Elvira, a very kind of like dumbed down. Most of the jokes she makes are not, in fact, about morbid things, but about her own breasts. She became this sort of valley girl goth that did the whole horror TV host thing and made an absolute fuck ton of money with all the merchandising. And I think there's 2 movies, which are both terrible. And Maila was cut out of all of that. And she was furious, and she managed to file a lawsuit about, stealing her intellectual property. But she didn't, I mean, if you're gonna bring that kind of lawsuit, you need a lot of money. And she just didn't. I mean, she had some initial support, and I think one lawyer worked pro bono for a bit, but it just wasn't enough to sustain the legal action that she would have needed to win. And she eventually lost the case and completely ran out of steam. But in the meantime, the punk band The Misfits kind of found her on Melrose, and she became well known in the nascent LA music underground. And she actually, and again, it's you'll see it in the documentary. She performs with, and she reads poetry, and there are records where she's part of the band, and there's songs written about her, and she becomes this sort of grandmotherly figure in punk culture in LA in the 80s and the 90s. And she starts to feel the love again because Plan 9 from Outer Space is now kind of getting a lot of traction on the late night movie theater circuit. And Tim Burton makes the Ed Wood movie and features Lisa Marie, who was Tim Burton's girlfriend at the time, as Vampira, and they consult with Vampira about her portrayal, invite her to screenings, and she's still not making any money, but she's feeling the warmth and the love again, and all these people who love Vampira. And in that sort of ensuing, I guess, 30 years, everything that was Vampira has become goth subculture. Yeah. So she's sort of engendered
sort
that.
Of proto-goth.
Yeah. And, there's opportunities for merchandising with T-shirts. There's, all kinds of, there's still actually lots. There's an official Vampira merchandising website. So she starts to actually make not huge amounts of money, but people do pay her for things. I think in 1980, Marlon Brando sent her $200. I think that was the last money he ever sent her. And she spends it on making T-shirts. So it's an investment. Oh. And she's in the mid 80s, she's lived in Hollywood all this time. She's kind of clung on, and she makes a record with Tomato Du Plenty of the Screamers. She makes a record with Satan's Cheerleaders, and she's actually an early adopter of the internet, and she starts selling memorabilia and her original art on eBay. Like I said, she remains true to her artistic instincts, and she is able to get some money from some of the designs for things like skateboards and some of the figurines. It's not much, but she actually, the last years of her life are not lived in the bleak poverty that a lot of her other years have been lived in. And my very favorite things about Vampira is at the end of her life, she lived just a couple of blocks from me on North Serrano, just north of Sunset, and we would have shopped at the same Food for Less, which has now been bulldozed, and they're building a giant apartment building there. It was actually the site of a movie studio back in the 20s to the 60s, I think, the Fox Studios. And she's got, as I said, she's got her rescue animals. She's got a lot of people who care for her, including the comedian Dana Gould, who give her money, who make sure she's got groceries. And she ends her life January 10th of 2008. She dies of natural causes, but she's 85. So that's an incredible run for somebody who, went through all the things that she went through. And she's found with her cat. It takes a couple of days for her body to be found. So she's found and her cat dies.
That's really sad.
That's really sad. But there's her dog, but they have to put her dog to sleep because it's traumatized and not able to be handled. And then she's buried in our favorite place, Hollywood Forever, overlooking the lake And, you know, about 60 people show up for her funeral. And in the Vampira and Me documentary, that, you know, the guy stresses that those people came to Maila's funeral. They were Maila's friends. They weren't Vampira fans. But if you go to her grave, there are all kinds of tributes to, I went a couple of weeks ago, said hi. And there are all kinds of tributes to this day, like people leave lipsticks, pins, flowers, all kinds of things, because they remember her. She shone very briefly, but very brightly.
There's so much in her story that is about fame in Hollywood. What do you take away from her story?
It's kind of hard to articulate, because it is about that purity and that belief in this very abstract thing we think of as the Hollywood dream. Like, she always had the option to go back to Oregon, to go back, live with her. Her brother invited her back to live with them a number of times, but she couldn't live anywhere but here. And she always lived in a few blocks radius. And she always, I think she got up and she created, and she had her animals, and that was enough.
Yeah. And she didn't live a generic life. She, like, you could have like a generic clean middle-class life, or you could just commit fully to your dream and live maybe a messy life, maybe a kind of, in the end, a little hard scrabble. Oh no, I can't pay my rent. Oh no. But you're like pursuing your dream, and you're not just pursuing your dream in a generic way. You're like, I have this vision of being authentic, and I'm going to commit to myself.
Yeah. When people talk about living the dream, they kind of assume it's the big house, fancy cars, pool parties. But living the dream is what she did.
Yes.
Which was, like I say, every day she got up and she created something, whether she was upcycling furniture or making jewelry, or designing a costume, or, you know, painting or drawing, or, you know, there's a tape extant of a memoir that she was maybe working on. She told stories to people. She really did perform and create every day of her life. And that, to me, is living the dream.
Why do you think it was so important for her to stay in Hollywood?
Oh, is it about Osiris's penis?
I don't know. Maybe it could be. I'm going to go visit Osiris's penis this weekend.
Yeah, it's that inexplicable pull of this zip code.
I feel like New Orleans has a pull for some people. Hollywood has a pull for some people.
New York.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's the whole kind of like boulevard of broken dreams that I live off. I think it's endlessly fascinating, and I think I might be writing a book about it. But she made her choices, and in the end, as I say, it kind of worked out for her.
I mean, she ultimately created an image that seared itself into people's brains that can then be extrapolated as a symbol of femininity on one hand, feminism, rebellion, embracing of the shadow self.
And doing it with kind of humor and this fake aristocratic darlings accent, and, you know, doing it in a way that says, I am poking fun by being fun, but I'm enjoying the company of my pet spider. I'm drinking poisonous cocktails. I'm laughing about the murders I've committed. Slaying. She slayed.
Yeah. Yes, she slayed. That genre of character, like the Morticia Addams, Vampira, Lily Munster, Elvira. What is that genre of character?
I think they're just the vamp. I mean, and you can trace that back to the 1920s.
Like, but Theda Bara.
Just the idea of this powerful sexual woman who can do all kinds of forbidden things, who is a forbidden thing because there's that hint of necrophilia. She is a forbidden thing who does forbidden things, yet she's still incredibly attractive. And, you know, it's Thanatos. It's the inverse of Eros. Yeah. Except it's all kind of like mixed up into one voluptuous package.
Worship of death.
Yeah.
The death goddess energy. And that we're all striving for.
Yeah, and we need her as a kind of counterpoint to the fertility goddess. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, like Vampira, and I would say that there's a massive Substack piece that will hopefully drop around the same time as this. So if you want to read more about my thoughts on Vampira, please look for that. Maila did actually meet Norma Jean and Marilyn Monroe, who was in many ways, she peaked around the same time and was the inverse in that she was the blonde fertility goddess. Wow. And I think, we have these, the dark and the light of the yin and the yang, and the way that they sort of balanced each other out. And, there was this sort of fetishization of blonde, voluptuous women in pop culture in the 1950s who were all, it's very sort of soft featured as well, whereas Vampira was angular. Yeah. I think Hedda Hopper described her as thin cheeked, which is like the ultimate put down. Yeah, she represents all the things that maybe we do yearn for when we're not yearning for reproduction and facility. She's about the embrace of death, because the grave is an embrace. It's the only embrace we get, the only permanent embrace.
I'm thinking maybe that type of character is the only connection to like the Sumerian goddess Inanna or Ishtar, which are goddess characters that have been forbidden since the rise of Christianity. But those goddess characters were about both fertility and death. These were the goddesses that went into the underworld and took off their 7 layers of clothing and sacrificed themselves and then rose again. Whereas these days in the Christian realm, it's like, Mother Mary, like the motherly archetype is what's okay, but we don't have a connection, Western European connection to the dark femininity that Inanna gave us in our, pre-Christian world. I just kind of thought in my head.
Yeah, and I think, the divine feminine, in order to be truly powerful, has to encompass both. You have to be both birth and death to be a full-on, entity. And, we all come from women and we all end up in the grave's embrace. So, they're the bookends of our experience. And it's this representation of death as sexually alluring goes back to the Romantics and the first kind of like, the vampire, John Polidori and all of that. And, I'm not going to start talking about sex and vampires because we'll be here for another 5 hours. But there is that idea that sex and orgasm is a little death. And so, I mentioned Vampira's trademark scream, and Maila said it was meant to be kind of orgasmic. So I think, that's the appeal. They show us that there is ecstasy in death as well as in fertility.
I love that. And that's a good place to end today. Where can people find you and what are you working on?
I'm working on various things on my Substack, The Haunted Path, which is in the show notes. And I know a lot of you cross-pollinate from there. And I rescued a little tabby cat the other day. So if anybody, he's hiding in the bathroom now. He still has his cone on from being fixed. So he's not ready for his close-up yet. But if anybody's looking to adopt a sweet, friendly, very loving, very affectionate, and very talkative little tabby cat who I'm calling Toby for now, then please hit me up. And photos will be on my Substack and my Blue Sky.
Oh, I can't wait to see a photo of him when he's got his cone off.
Yes.
Well, and I am going this weekend, like I said, to the hill where Osiris's penis is. And I'm going to do some tarot cards with Andrea. And we might record some things while we're there and see what happens. Cool. And we're also working on a Bigfoot episode. So stay tuned. We have lots coming soon on this podcast. You all can follow us on Instagram at Haunted Hollywood Hour Podcast, all one word. If you have ideas for future episodes or want to be on a future episode, email me at hauntedhollywoodhour@gmail.com. We are building our little community. We have, I'd say now about 120 people who follow this podcast. So thank you so much. Share it with your friends so that our little community can grow, and if you want, give us a little rating and a little review so other people can find it. Until next time, bye.